Be a minute or so different, but need to make a few announcements first. If you, when you came in today, you noticed the brick on the building looked nicer. Kirk was up here yesterday, uh, power washing or whatever you call that. He was cleaning off the outside of the building. Also, if you've looked around, there's some new furnishings going on, and there's more to come. So Lisa has been doing that. Uh, Need to keep sick folks in mind. Brother Terry is still not doing good. Janice said this morning that he was still fatigued and weak, and also his that cough is coming back. So they got an appointment tomorrow to go see the doctor on that. Uh, Holly is continuing to have issues with her back. They got an appointment tomorrow back up in Birmingham. Look at that. And the last word they had was there might be additional surgery and have to fuse everything. So if they fuse her whole back, that's going to create some other difficulties. So keep her in your prayers. Uh, it's great to see Joy back. She had we won't call it an extended illness, but she was sick for a while. So good to see her back. The Moody's are back. Kevin was looking good. Is there anyone else on the sick and injured list that we need to? The days are out of town traveling, so keep them in mind. And I thank you again for your prayers. And I've got an appointment with my cardiologist Tuesday. Probably will wind up doing a bunch of tests because I went to my regular doctor this past Thursday and he had all the reports from the hospital, and that portion of it was good news. There was no indication of any damage or anything like that. So, but no known cause for what happened to me. So that's where the specialist comes in. So, and he had mentioned two things: possibly having to wear a monitor for a month, which is not going to be a fun thing to do. And he also mentioned the word ablation. And I know some of you in here have had it or at least know what it is. But my thinking is they got to figure out something that's going on before they know where to go. So we'll just have to check that out and see. But again, I thank you for your prayers. We got a lot of events coming up. The first the first Friday in March is we're hosting the area-wide singing here. Then that's the following, or Saturday then, Friday the singing. Saturday is Wetumpka's Ladies' Day. Encourage y'all that can go do that. Rides will be available. And then the following Saturday, the 14th, is Ladies' Day here. So as you can see, we've got some things coming up here. So anything else we need to mention before we begin our Bible study? No? Brother Grant, would you lead us in a prayer, please? Amen. 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. Everybody's looking at me funny. I know we're in the book of Genesis. I know we're going to be talking about Noah, but we're going to start in 1 Peter chapter 3. Over the past 3 weeks, we did an overview of Noah. Then we looked specifically at building the ark, how big it was, what all it would hold, give you some ideas on how to visualize the size of it. Then we talked about all the hard times that all the evil in the world and everything getting on the ark and how things lasted on the ark. And today we're going to start looking at God's promise dealing with Noah. And that's where we start in 1 Peter chapter 3. And if you'll look at verses 20 and 21, Peter talking says, which sometimes were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. And this is the connection, the importance of it. The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So Peter looks back and talks about how 8 were saved by water during the flood. And if you recall, we had talked about, if we go back to a couple of, one chapter back into chapter 6, chapter 7 and verse 16, where it said, and they went in male and female of flesh, as God hath commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. So by the Lord shutting in the 8 souls and all the animals on the ark, what did he shut out? If you shut something in, you got to keep something out. So what he was shutting out was all the evil in the world. Everything was going to die off there. So that brings us then to verse 24 of chapter 7. It says, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So after the floods came, after the fountains of the deep opened up, water came up from beneath, the rains came down from heaven, window of heaven was open and rains came down. It said it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and then that stopped. But still, what happens when there is a flood? If some of you can recall, back in, I think it was 1990 or so here in Alabama, that here in Millbrook, we hardly had any rain. However, the road was closed getting to the interstate, because when you got down to where the boat place is now, that Casada, get to the toll road, from just past that light, there was water up to the graveyard that's on the right. And why was that? All the water that came down from the north, because they had 16, 17 inches of rain in 2 days. So, and here with the fountain of the deep being opened up, that just meant that the water continued to stay there for this 150 days. And then as it started to abate and go back into its place, that's why, even though it only rained for 40 days and 40 nights, that's why the flood actually lasted a year. They went on board the ship in the 600th year of Noah's life, and they came off at 601. So, and it gives the months. So it was if you add it all up, it was around 360 days, plus minus an hour or two, that the flood was actually there. Questions or comments then through chapter 7? As we open up with chapter 8, the third word in the King James says remembered, and God remembered Noah. Now wait a minute. Now, God was mad at man And 100 years ago, God told them to get on board the ark that they had built a year ago and shut them in. Does that mean that God just went about doing his own thing for a year and now all of a sudden he remembers, hey, I got a boat out there with some people on it? No. What does it mean? God was in control. God worked with them. And when the word here used remember, we also have to think in our daily life that there's a lot of things that, oh, yeah, hey, I remember that. But on the other hand, we remember sort of on a continual basis, don't we? That's when it says remember. How many of you have forgotten your anniversary date? Yeah. And you think about it periodically, it's not like just all of a sudden, well, I guess some folks that have to come in and be hit over the head. For the most part, we remember things on a continual basis, and that's what was happening here. God remembered that Noah was there and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And then God made a wind to pass over the earth and the waters assuaged. What does the word assuaged mean? We don't use that word much anymore, except us old mossbacks. Subsided, retreated. I'm sorry? Yes, ma'am. So went away. You can look at it a number of ways, but the, what does wind do when it comes to water, other than makes waves? It helps in evaporation, doesn't it? And also, if you've always lived in the South, you can, and some of us old timers, we used to hang laundry on the line to dry outside. And you'd do your wash as early in the morning as you could, and you'd hang it on the line, and then most of the time by mid-afternoon or so, you could go out and get it off the line, and it would be dry, unless it was some heavy bib overalls or something that took a little longer to dry. Well, Andrea and I have actually lived in one location where she would do her laundry, she would walk out and put the clothes on the line and go circle around and take them off the line. They were dry. At the time, Tucson, Arizona had about a 15, on average, 15% humidity level. Extremely dry. I could be playing softball, and I learned very quickly between every ending of softball, I would go straight to the water fountain because I was getting dehydrated. You wouldn't know it by looking at me because there wasn't a drop of sweat on me. That's how fast it was evaporating. We could look out and see rain off in the distance, and rain, a hard rain, and it would never touch the ground. And you could see it as it evaporated from the outsides in. It would just be raining like crazy, but it would look like an upside down toadstool, dry. So if it had rained out and the atmosphere was dry and the winds passed over, that would help with the evaporation and help things up. And also, we mentioned last week about the fountains of the deep, how below the earth crust, between the upper and lower mantle, that they have found ocean water. So there was a place for all of it to go. Verse 2 says, the fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So that takes into account how the flood not only came, but how the flood went away, because there's some skeptics or some critics that want to say, if all that water was on this earth, where did it go? couldn't have possibly been a flood because there would have still been that water. Well, not necessarily. We discussed also last week how deep the Mariana Trench was. Was the Mariana Trench here in the antediluvian period? Don't know. But if it opened up, look how much water that would hold. So this earth that God created is a marvelous creation. And if he said it, did it, they did it. Questions, comments? His hand was in creating it, and his hand was now in solving the problem for him. Verse 3, we'll start reading there and go for a ways. It says, "And the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. The ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually unto the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made." Okay. It's not raining anymore. The water's abating. The ark has come to rest. Moses tells us that it was on Mount Ararat, but at the time, I'm sure Noah didn't know where he was. The ark had just settled on some land. He opened up a window, and apparently, from what we can tell, from here on down, he's sending out some birds to search out the area. So it may be that the window is up high or a location where he can't get a visual on it, because it's not until later when he takes the covering off that they can see what's going on out there. But the window is open. And now here's where we get slowing down. "And he sent forth a raven, which went to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth." Question: is a raven one of the clean animals that came in by sevens, or is a raven one of the unclean animals that came in male and female? Someone turn to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11. I'm sorry, Leviticus, not Eviticus. Leviticus chapter 11. And read verse 13. Well, just read the first part of 13 and then skip down and read all of 15.
And these are they which ye shall have an abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination, the eagle and the osprey and the ostrich, every raven after his kind.
So every raven after his kind is considered an unclean animal. And they came in, by, therefore, if you go back, how did the unclean animals come on board? Male and female, a pair. Here he sends out the only pair. Now, the reason I mention this is when it says to and fro, there are some people out in the religious world, as they discuss it, that they want to say that because it was a raven and because it was unclean, and a raven is a scavenger, it's possible that the raven went out and found all this floating stuff that they could eat, and they just lived out there and never came back to the ark. Well, if that be true, whether it was the male raven or the female raven, we have ravens today. So that raven must have, by going to and fro, it, to me at least, it doesn't mean that he ever came back into the ark, but he could have come and rested on the ark until, because he moved back and forth. not that he went out and stayed out. Does that make sense? And verse 8 then says, and he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the earth. So, same question. Is a dove a clean or an unclean animal? Clean? How do we know that? Because nowhere in Scripture does it ever say in the classification of cleans and uncleans, does it distinguish that? So how do we know a dove was a clean animal? I got two hands going up. First, it was an animal used for sacrifice. They call it turtle dove, but still, yeah, and bingo. And also, when we get to the New Testament, when Jesus was baptized, what happened? A dove, like a dove, came and sat on him. So you would not use that representation if it was an unclean animal. But more precisely, I think we'll go back to where the dove or the turtle dove was one that was used in sacrifice. So that meant that it had to be a clean animal. Even though, as I say, when you look and try to find a listing of specific clean and unclean, you won't find it in that listing. That is true. But since you brought that point up, let me address it this way. If the raven, as some say, was a scavenger and was feeding on carrion, decaying flesh that was still floating around out there, does that not violate chapter 1 of Genesis, where it says that, go to chapter 1 and verse 29 to start. Chapter 1, verse 29 says, and God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, and it was so. Meat being food, and it was so. So, if you look at that one verse, it indicates that prior to the flood, there were no carnivorous beings. Everything was plant eaters. It's when Noah comes off the ark, then that he is told that everything, you can eat anything, being a meat eater, as long as you don't eat the blood. So, in this little transition period here, does that mean that the raven already had knowledge that he could go out and be a scavenger and eat the dead flesh? I pose that only as food for thought. Think about it. But as we get back to the dove here in verse 9, then it says, the dove found no place for the sole of her foot, and she returned into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Put forth his hand, took her, pulled her in, stayed yet another 7 days, sent the dove out again. Verse 11, the dove came into him that evening, and in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off, so no one knew that the waters were abating, or at least abating. Stayed yet another 7 days, and sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. So he sent the birds out to test. Now, here's something else. Why didn't he immediately open up the ark and start getting off? Why does he continue to wait? Because as we go into the rest of the chapter here, he waits several more days before he does anything. Pardon? God hadn't told him to yet. Well, there's two things. We'll find out that God does tell them when it's time to get off. It doesn't say open the door or whether they could do it themselves. But again, if water has been standing in your yard for 2 or 3 days, when you see no water on that ground, can you immediately go out there and cut your grass? What's going to happen? You have to not only have time for the water to dissipate from the surface, you got to let the earth dry out a little bit. If all them animals had come off immediately when you could see no water, they're going to get stuck, aren't they? If they're beasts. Birds might not, but you know. Ground was soft. So then verse 13 tells us it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Nowhere do we know precisely what it means by remove the covering. Yes, sir. Well, God has made us a marvelous planet. If we look at how often plant life is submerged in water and is dormant, look how long it's covered with snow. And then as soon as the snow melts, what happens? Everything thrives again. God had a direct hand in doing all this, and Andrew and I was watching a nature program yesterday where there's a frog, and I can't name the name of the frog, but it lives in a northern environment. But the frog basically creates within itself something like an antifreeze that's in the organs, because when the cold weather sets in, the frog can literally, on examination, be dead. There is no heartbeat. There is no movement. The eyes are open and frozen. But then as it thaws out, as soon as it gets warm, it's off and running like nothing ever happened. So there's some things in nature that I don't think we'll ever understand until we can ask if there, as my son says, I hope there's a question and answer period. So yeah, I've run into one or two of those. So. Matter of fact, the first time I saw it, well, it was its cousin. I wasn't in Alaska when I saw it, but its cousin is in Colorado, up in the high mountains. And the first time I was out looking for some wood to build a fire and broke off a branch that I thought they swarmed up on me, and my arm was like just a runway for them. It was like B-52s coming in on a runway. They were so large. But verse 13, it tells us precisely when all of it took place. And then we get to what Brother David just mentioned, that God hadn't told him yet. So verse 15 says, God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons wives with thee. So they'd been on the ship or on the ark this long, and as I say, there's no indication of what that covering may have been. It's I take it to be that something, it was on the top of the ark in some way, whether it was badger skins as in the tabernacle or wood like he was told to build the ark out of. Once that was removed and they could get in a position to look and observe everything that was going on, they could see everything. But then it took God to tell them it's time. So when they left, it's also verse 17 or 16 says, "Go forth of the ark, the sons, wives, etc. Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle and of every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth." Then Noah went forth, sons, wives, etc., beasts, etc. And look what happens immediately. Verse 20. Noah builded an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So that's why that was necessary for them to bring in more than a pair of clean, because they're being used for sacrifice, will also be used for food as we get into a little bit later. But I want to pause right there for just a minute, because go to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 2. 22 and 2.
And said, Take now thy son, and his son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there on burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of.
Okay. Now, the reason I brought this up, we're going to be studying Abraham next month, but the reason I bring that up here, where it's talking about Noah building an altar and sacrificing, Jewish tradition has it that where Noah built the altar and sacrificed is the same place that Abraham was told to go and sacrifice Isaac. That's Jewish tradition. But if you look at maps, according to the Bible, that ain't so. Because and they put this up in the Garden of Eden also. They say they tie it to Adam and Eve. But where is Mount Moriah or Mount Moriah on a map in conjunction with Mount Ararat spelled out in the Bible? Where Adam and Eve was, if you are looking at a map, it's sort of up in the northern area, northeast area, and then Mount Ararat over here in Turkey, but then Mount Moriah is down here basically in the land of Canaan, several hundred miles south of there. So if you're just looking at a map and trying to put those three places on a map of where they think the Garden of Eden was, where Abraham was when he offered Isaac, by name in the Bible, name a location in the Bible, and name of location where the ark rested, they're hundreds of miles apart. They're not in the same area. So the only thing that we know specifically is in chapter 8 is when the ark landed, they said it was Mount Ararat. Ararat is a mountain chain. It's not just one mountain, but it's a mountain chain, and they don't specify which particular peak it was on. But then Noah, being a righteous person, first thing he did then was offer sacrifice to God, one of every clean animal. Verse 21 says, and the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said unto his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So there are a lot of people that want to say that, and I've even heard some prominent TV evangelists make comment about floods and all that God's wrath, God's taking vengeance on this group of people or that group of people by bringing floods. How many of you in here believe the Bible? I hope everybody. So if that be true, when it says the Lord smelled the sweet savor and he's not going to curse the ground anymore, he's not going to destroy anything anymore, does that mean that he's not going to destroy anything anymore, that things are going to run now their natural course until the end of time? For man's sake. Absolutely. Yep. Then when we start in verse 9, it says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now we come into a change in this next verse, a little change. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Prior to the flood, what was man's relationship to animals? Beast, fowl. Pardon?
Similar to that of Disney movies.
I'm sorry, I still.
Similar to that of Disney movies.
Similar to Disney movies. Pets, etc. They were to have dominion over, which could have meant that the animals obeyed them and everybody got along because there were no meat eaters in the group. Now, when fear and dread is used, what does that indicate? Now things are starting to take the pecking order that we know. How many of you would go out into the wild and walk up to a brown bear or a black bear or a polar bear and say, hey, buddy? Only once. Only once. So there's that little separation that things are beginning to be a little different. Also, what is one of the major things that took place from this point forward versus what it had been in the antediluvian time, dealing with man? How long did man live prior to the flood? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and almost 1,000 years at times, right? If you look at a chart from the time of the flood and all the people named in the chart, their age starts tapering off after the flood. And when we get another 1,000 years later to the time of Moses, Miriam lives to about 130, Moses 120. Then as we proceed, ages go down a little bit more. Was that due to environment change from prior flood to after flood? Or did it have to do with diet? Prior flood, after flood? Or a combination of all of it? Or that God just said, man, don't need to live this long anymore. So you made an interesting point. You said it hadn't rained before the flood. What do you base that on? Okay. All right. Chapter 2, verse 6 is the one I think you want. Chapter 2, verse 6. So, if you take that, chapter 2 and verse 6, that something came up and watered the ground, no word of rain is mentioned until we get to Noah and the flood.
Verse 5 actually says the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth.
And that's the way that the earth was being watered. So we don't know what the atmospheric conditions were prior to the flood, how everything worked. We know what's taking place now, and we know how things worked after the flood because we've got some good literature that tells us. But verse 3 then says, everything that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. All right. So now, whereas man, beast was vegetarian prior to the flood, now after the flood, people and animals can be omnivores, I suppose you want to put it. They can eat anything. So, correct? Correct. So now you got, well, we know before the flood, the Bible tells us that everything was herbivores, everything ate grass. After this, there are carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores. There's some that eat like humans, we eat some of everything. Some of us do anyway. So, running out of time. Getting down to verse 13 real quick. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. The importance of this, I think, ties back with everything that we have said. He mentions a bow in the clouds, which we call a rainbow today. And a rainbow is created because of moisture in the air, water in the air, and the sun reflecting off of it, etc. Now, there are some folks that say, well, it could have rained. There could have been rainbows before this. We don't know. But if God was going to set it up as a token of a covenant, wouldn't he pick something new? Something that wasn't just already man had seen? Because if he's going to put it out there for him to remember the earth, if you've seen rainbows, what's the significance of it then? So I take it to be that this sort of just reinforces what Brother Jim said there. Going back to chapter 2 and verse 6, that the mist came up and watered. Don't know the atmospherics from there. But now the flood came. Now we're in a cycle of rain. And now that sun's going to create a rainbow. And when God sees the rainbow, he remembers the promise made. When we see the rainbow, we can understand the promise that was made. I think it very interesting. How many of you have seen a rainbow in your life? Every hand should go up. How many of you have seen a double rainbow? Most hands go up. Question: did you know that every time you see a rainbow, there is a double rainbow? But because of your angle or your viewpoint, a lot of times you don't see that second rainbow. But a rainbow is caused by a reflection and a refraction, and the double rainbow is caused by a reflection, reflection, refraction, refraction. So it's all there. And every time you see one, there is a second one, even though you might not see it. And also, if you've ever noticed, and the reason I say reflection, refraction bit is the primary colors are reversed. Next time you see a double rainbow, if you look, the top is the bottom and the thigh, da 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 da. It's just like it's flipped over. So, thank y'all so much for your comments. Absolutely.